Rinpoche, Venerable Abbots, Rinpoches, Venerable Sangha, eminent scientists and scholars. It is a privilege for me to share a little bit about what we have been doing at Emory University for the last several years based on a program called Cognitively Based Compassion Training. It's a training that I will say a little bit about associated with some of the findings applying this particular meditation, what kind of benefits we have found so far. In 1998, His Holiness the Dalai Lama visited Emory University to deliver the commencement speech. The commencement speech is a speech for the students who would be graduating from the university. And there, in the speech, His Holiness said that, I believe that education is like an instrument. Whether that instrument is used properly or constructively depends on the user. We have education on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a good person. A good person means someone with a good heart, a sense of caring for welfare of others. Education and the warm heart, a compassionate heart. If you combine these two, then your education, your knowledge will be constructive. And that's where we see a tremendous need in the modern world. Perhaps not in these communities here, the contemplative communities, like the monasteries, the huge monasteries here, but in the modern world, particularly in the developed countries, we see that the education system is in some ways incomplete, as many of the speakers in the past few days have pointed out. In the education, what is needed is the education for spirituality. In 2000, His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote a book called The Ethics for the New Millennium. And in the Ethics for the New Millennium, the ethics for this new millennium that we have started about 12 years ago, we're just barely on the 13th year, there he mentions the need for a spiritual revolution. Spiritual revolution. There have been many revolutions on this earth. Of course, the Industrial Revolution that brought a tremendous benefits for humanity in terms of physical means, whether it's in the field of medicine or technology, of course, in the material world. But what His Holiness points out is the need for spiritual revolution. By spirituality, His Holiness is not, of course, not advocating for a religion, definitely not some kind of organized religion. The spirituality in that writing, in that text, His Holiness defines as something that is basic, known as, seen as basic human values that the whole humanity, in some ways, potentially, or some form that is kind of inherent to the humanity, like compassion, like love, generosity. These universal values, of course, the foundation of most of the religions, but not limited to the religion. Those are basic human values. And we are learning now that they are not just they're limited to humans either. Compassion and empathy. These are the qualities that we are seeing also literally in all mammals. Certainly in rats, in monkeys, in elephants and others, certainly that birds and so forth. But it's the compassion that is what His Holiness is appealing for in order to promote the kind of spiritual revolution, if you will. Compassion is, of course, is the foundation for ethical behavior. Now, certainly, it's so one that is most needed if we were to live in an ethical way. So how do we go about bringing into education these values like compassion and empathy and so forth? As we know that because of these values have strong grounding in the religions, certainly this education that is secularly based would be quite skeptical about incorporating a syllabus that would talk about compassion. So while it is the fact that compassion is not limited to religion, but there needs to be some way to convince the larger educational system and the public that compassion is something that can be understood on secular basis. And that's why His Holiness, in the latest book, Beyond Religion, The Ethics for the New World, or the Whole World, appeals to the scientific community. As he says here, that I have always felt that if science could show such practices like compassion, loving kindness, attention, all these practices that we heard extensively in this conference from the scientists, that these practices to be both possible and beneficial, then perhaps they could even be promoted through mainstream education. So the scientific study of these practices is very important to show that these are not something based on just belief and kind of faith, but rather these are skills that can be taught in a secular manner, and when it's taught, they can bring benefit to the individuals as well as to the society. So one of the methods for cultivating compassion we have developed at Emory University, it's called the cognitively based compassion training. And this is a protocol or a program for training in compassion that is based on Lojong tradition, or the mind training tradition of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. I say it Indo-Tibetan because the extensive practices for training the mind, such as compassion and bodhicitta, the altruistic mindset, as well as all the contemplative practices that we are seeing today's world, like the mindfulness, attention, and so forth and so on, that we find in this literature very extensively outlined systematically in the early texts like the Bodhicharyavatara and many other earlier texts. And of course, certainly in Tibet, when these Lojong practices or the teachings were brought into Tibet in quite uninterruptedly for over 1,000 years. These are the practices that community as a whole has embraced and specialized and practiced, not only studied in a very kind of, through close attention, but also applied in their practices. And so it is a living tradition. It is a secular, it's made secular in the sense that that very specific religious elements from training the mind, that Buddhist specific religious elements such as the reincarnation or the life before and life after, in order to cultivate a sense of kind of connectedness with others, that there are the steps in cultivating compassion, that what is called the marcia, or the recognizing all beings as your mother, and that is not just like a mother, like your mother, but rather literally, that each and every sentient being has been your mother in one lifetime or another. But of course, that cannot be part of the secular protocol, so those are taken out. But otherwise, there is not much that is taken out that from what is there. So based on that, we identify in those the 6 steps. Number 1, developing attentional stability. As we have heard from Dr. Richard Davidson and others, that how attention is such an important element of our life, that without attention we can't do anything properly. And in today's world, attention is one thing that is that is kind of being diminished through our modern day the practices. The average the kind of attention span in America, average attention span is 8 seconds for humans. You know that what is the average attention span for goldfish? It's 9 seconds. The goldfish has better attention than the humans, according to the surveys. So what does that tell? Also, when the attention is distracted, you know that when you are engaged at a task, and there are these constant distractions to something else, average time for someone to come back to the task, according to an article in Newsweek a few years ago, is 20 minutes. So if you are at job for 8 hours, and then if you get distracted, not necessarily every 8 seconds, hopefully not, but you know that if you are distracted by phone call or you think that you need to do something and like that, and if it takes average 20 minutes to come back, how much of time is wasted, productivity? Now, attention is so important for learning. You know, that if for the students, if you don't have the attention, kind of good attention, how are students supposed to be able to learning? So attention is so important, but that is where that the cultivating attentional stability is the first part. I will go into this a little bit later. So this is based on the practices you find in the Buddhism. It's certainly not limited to Buddhism. It is a kind of the common to other traditions, certainly various Hindu traditions also, but there is nothing that it is religious in nature. Step number 2 is what we call the insights into thoughts and emotions. We heard from Dr. Richard Davidson that rumination takes how much of our time? 47% of the time if it goes into rumination. If those surveys are actually true, that is, again, it's a lot of waste. But not only that, for emotional regulation, if we were to then correct or regulate, transform some of those patterns, some of those thought patterns, emotional patterns that are destructive in nature, without having an insight into that, without being aware of them, how are we going to change it? So therefore, cultivating insights into our inner world of thoughts and emotions is a very important part. Many years ago, I was at a medical college, university in Texas, and to give a talk. And they have this program or department, I'm not sure actually, department or program. The program probably is for medical humanities. And I was intrigued by that, what about humanities in the medical program? And Dr. Verghese, he is actually the celebrated writer. He wrote a very famous book called The Tennis Partner. When I asked him about why humanities there, what he meant by that, he said that what the medical community needed is the basic human values in the medical schools, because without that, they find so much empathy distress or other forms of behavioral problems. In fact, of all the professions in America, the number 1 suicides that happen in the profession is in the medical community, according to Dr. Verghese. And it is, I read his book, Tennis Partner. Actually, he tells that story through his student who happened to be who was doing intern with him, who happens to be his tennis partner also. But what it means is that if the medical students, when they are taught in the first year, exposed to the dead bodies and other illnesses and so forth, if they were not given the tools to recognize their inner feelings and so forth, and then how to work with it, they simply end up kind of suppressing them. And then by suppressing them, you lose the opportunity to be aware of them and to work with them. So therefore, the third part is actually that for my Buddhist the fellows here, the self-compassion may seem a little bit kind of, funny actually. But what I mean by self-compassion really is not only kind of feeling good about, but it's about the Tibetan word nyejung, not necessarily for liberation, tarba. That is simply a deep resolve to emerge from whatever that faulty or unhealthy patterns that we have, whether it's the excessive rumination or the excessive the obsessions, anger, jealousy, all those emotional elements that when you notice through the insight how it has its impact on your health, then through reflections, not just sitting and thinking, but rather through very systematic analysis, critical analysis, and observations, to come to an understanding that these patterns, unhealthy patterns though, they can be transformed. And we can do that. Therefore, we must tackle them. That's the result. That's what I'm talking about, the self-compassion. Developing impartiality, of course, is that when in the sort of the standard curriculum for cultivating compassion and like that, it actually, that's where it's sort of the beginning step is often presented from impartiality. Developing impartiality is so important that as His Holiness the Dalai Lama points out, that we all have the capacity for this biological compassion, that to feel compassion for few nearest us. That's what Einstein also talked about, that. But can we expand that compassion to embrace those who are strangers to us, those who are even difficult to deal with us? Can we expand our compassion to beyond what Jim was talking about, beyond this in-group, that the immediate families or the circle of friends, to strangers and even adversaries? And that's where the impartiality, the practice in this Lojong tradition, there are specific strategies that are presented to break down that sort of the tendency, that habit to see the world in this concrete friends, strangers, and enemies. How you do that, that's the practice. It is outlined in that it's a very specific strategies. It's actually that from other side, what one needs to develop the understanding is that, as His Holiness often mentions, that every living being wants to be happy and to be free from suffering. That every living, the organism wants to survive and to avoid anything that undermines their survival. That's the kind of the basic instinct, even the most simple organisms. Of course, that the more sophisticated or evolved organisms certainly have the more of that sense of that. But to expand that basic instinct to the greater level, that what we need is the deliberate practices to expand, and therefore that by appealing to that reality, it's a reality that everyone wants to be happy and to be free of suffering. By tapping into that, infusing into one's awareness that reality, it's what helps one to kind of break down that concrete the categories, if you will, and then of course the further that if hypothetical kind of argument is raised, that why do we need to do that, how can we do that, certainly that the other ways is to appeal to another reality, that is that the friends and strangers and the adversaries are not necessarily permanent. They are not that stable. They change. So therefore, there is nothing from its own side for us to kind of hold, strong that these are enemies, and therefore, they are bad or they shouldn't be happy. So in other words, empathy training itself, actually, I believe that it provides a foundation for what I may call unconditional love and compassion. That if you begin relating to others from that most fundamental of the human aspirations, not what they look like, how much money or so forth they are, what position they are, not from that. But if you believe to appreciate from that fundamental aspiration that they share, to identify with that, then the other superficial matters don't really, the affect how we relate to them. Of course, for compassion or empathy, for compassion, the most important steps is this affectionate love and empathy. Affectionate love, there is a word, the Yongi Jampa in Tibetan, the Yongi Jampa. Empathy is a little trickier word, but in the Ethics for the New Millennium, His Holiness articulates that. Actually, it says, at least from the perspective of the empathy for others' suffering, that from that perspective, it's articulated as Shen Dungala Misoba. It is the sense of unbearability to see someone suffer, like a mother, like Christophe that was talking about his children. He's constantly thinking, if his children were to kind of fall and then get wounded or something, that it's something that he would feel most, immediately. What makes that is that endearing, affection that one has for the children, one's children, of close friend and so forth. So, the secret for compassion and love, not the affectionate love and the love are actually distinguished in Lamrim Chemo, the great exposition to the stages of path to enlightenment. That affectionate love is that quality of kind of tenderness with which you relate to others. That is the sense of endearment. And so of course, that we know that from the modern psychology that the empathy is so kind of critical for compassion, not necessarily the unhealthy kind of empathy distress, but empathic concern. That we can talk about a little bit how, and then really that based from there, that when you witness someone's suffering, you can't help but want to see the person relieved of that suffering. Like from your own child's pain, you would not need to think that I want to think that this person should be relieved. It's this spontaneous response. Please tell me 15 minutes before. So the compassion that arises when those conditions are there. So what is really needed is cultivating compassion, as Je Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelugpa School of Tibetan Buddhism, he says, he uses specific kind of metaphor of harvesting in order to get very rich harvest. What you need are many conditions, of course, but first thing for the kind of the compassion extended equally towards others, what we need to do like that, to have the harvest that is equally, growing. What you need is that first you need to level the field. Likewise, for the compassion to grow for all, in our hearts, we need to level our heart. That means that we need to develop that impartiality. Second crucial part, once the seed of compassion is planted in that field of our experience, mind stream, or in our lives, whatever we call it, to nurture that is what we need is the moisture, the water. So in the even field, when the seeds are planted, when it is nurtured by the moisture and other elements, then it grows and gives the abundant the harvest. Of course, you have to nourish, to be careful, keep, nourishing. So affectionate love of this kind of endearing is what is like the moisture. So those two are the most important factors. Of course, now what I like to say is that this program that we have developed, I want to say that it shares some of the findings that we have. Of course, this was developed in 2005, initially, in response to a growing mental health crisis or the problems in the university population, certainly at Emory. We had 2 students each year, committing suicide, around that year, and then other. So this program was developed actually to see if through compassion training, can we see any indicators that it can help deal with the everyday stresses. I mean, this university environment is very stressful, particularly for the first-year students. So therefore, that how you can, I mean, the others have spoken, but one thing that for my monastic, the community here, I would like to share is that in the West, the stress itself is not bad by nature, but it's the chronic stress that you live in and out every day. This chronic stress and this complex and busy life and the very complex life that modern societies live in. It is a constant source of stress. So therefore, stress is a source of many of our modern day problems. According to Herbert Benson, one of the pioneers in the meditation research from Harvard University, who did early studies with the meditation. According to him, up to 70 to 90% of the visits by patients to doctors is related to some form of stress. So therefore, we need to understand that can compassion training help reduce stress? How can we see that? So there are, because I don't have much time, but I will mention these two biochemicals. One is what is called the IL-6, interleukin-6. It is an immune cell that basically is related to the immune. This cell, when it is activated, it makes inflammation. Inflammation, when it grows out of control, it itself becomes a source of many problems. You do need inflammation when you have viruses and so forth to tackle with them. But the modern life, the too much stress, it's like something like keeping the car running without going anywhere, engine on, then it will wear and tear the engine. So like that. So when elevated levels of IL-6 is correlated, whether it's caused or not, I don't know, but it's correlated with like heart attacks, Alzheimer's, many of our modern day illnesses. So, and also cortisol is just a classical kind of hormone, stress hormone. There is another one. So without going in detail, we needed to study that if after 6 weeks of this training, do they show difference? So the top bar you see on the left, the side, it's before meditation, and the right side on the top is afterwards for IL-6, checking IL-6, and the same thing for the cortisol. You see that from the what we found is that actually that we had control group, but with the control and the study group, we didn't see significant difference. But within the meditation group, those who meditated quite a lot, and those who came to class and did not meditate. So we leveled them low practice and high practice. In those two, before meditation, there is no difference in terms of those chemicals. In response to a certain stress, you put them in a stress test. But after meditation, you can see that this black line, that is the high meditation group, that's much lower. Same thing for cortisol, that I think it was Richie who mentioned that cortisol, of course, that when you are faced with a stressor, something that stresses, it goes up. The benefit of this need to be measured, how soon it comes down. That shows also the resiliency. So there also, before meditation, there is no difference. Afterwards, you see the black line, that how quickly it comes down. Another part that I wanted to show is very quickly, please tell me when there is 5 minutes, okay? Just when there is 5 minutes. It is Tanya and Richie also, they all mentioned how important is the empathy, for compassion. I mean, recently in the United States, there was a shooting in a school in Connecticut, and 20 young kids, elementary school kids were killed, and 6 staff, their faculty and staff. In the media, when the commentators, the expert commentators, when they came, one thing that was almost everyone, pointing out was the lack of empathy in today's world. It's a lack of empathy, difficulty to relate to others' pain and suffering, that inability to, that is what the problem. Thus, compassion meditation improves your empathy or not. And at Emory, when we tested that, you can do that 2 ways. Either you can the measure through fMRI machine, the brain waves in the several parts, but particularly one area. I believe this is an old program, unfortunately here. But anyway, there is the very right side, the brain part. It's the inferior frontal gyrus, that the one area. I'm not a neuroscientist, but Tanya can tell more. Apparently, this is a brain that is very rich with what is called mirror neurons, that a certain part of neurons, brain cells that pick up others, the feelings and so forth. In this training, we found that not only the meditators, compassion meditation group, gets better, more accurate in telling what kind of emotional states others have through reading the eyes, through the eyes, reading the mind, in the eyes, through eyes, but also their brain shows that heightened activity in that part of the brain. That means that compassion makes you more accurate in empathy. Your empathy becomes more accurate. Now, this is another study from the study at Emory. We have done with the same. This is with the grown-up population. There, with comparing mindfulness and compassion training, two kind of meditation, and then we did have a control group also. What we found is actually quite, this is something that Tanya and others can probably shed some light. But we found something different there, actually, that in this compassion, these meditators, after they have done meditation, they are brought to the scanner, and then they are put into the scanner, and then they are shown images of some kind of very emotional images, negative images, like the people who are in great pain, positives, people smiling or so forth, and then neutral. And then seeing that if the amygdala, the Richard Davidson mentioned, remember the amygdala is such a kind of crucial part for emotion. And we try to see that if there is any difference before and after. Interestingly, in the mindfulness attention training, after 8 weeks of these are 8 weeks training, that they all actually, the reaction to those images actually all go down, except in the compassion group. For the negative emotion, there is a heightened activity. That the red bar you see in the compassion is for the negative images. But on the other hand, when you give them the questionnaire, for depression, in the attention there is no difference before and after. In the compassion, that they score lower in depression. So it tells something that, and this is something I think that in the Richard Davidson's lab also with the adapt meditators, I think that they found something similar to that in terms of the amygdala activation in the adapt meditators. Since I have very little time, so I want to move a little faster. Can we teach this in the population, to the population who are at high risk, like the foster care children who have gone through a lot of problems, neglected by their own parents and so forth? And this is a population in the modern world, in America certainly, that needs a tremendous attention that we need to give. But there's ample evidence to show that the children who have gone through this very traumatic or difficult situation in childhood, they are predisposed to many of the problems, including depression that Sona mentioned today. So we want one commissioner, Vijay Walker of Georgia. Commissioner is a statewide kind of organization that looks after foster care children, among others. One day, she invited us to bring this program. What she said was that we have no shortage of programs for kids in care, meaning in their foster care, but they all are focused on changing external circumstances. We need a program that brings about inner change, and I feel that Emory's Compassion program is exactly what our children needed. This kind of this reminds me of a phrase in Bodhicharya Avtara that where in relation to dealing with anger, where it says that if when one were to cover the entire surface of the earth with leather to avoid the thorns and so forth, how could that be possible? But by simply covering your own feet with the shoes, the leather, it accomplished the same purpose. So bringing kind of the changing inside, that the inner perspective is what is needed. So here, with these students also, we found that in terms of another, the stress hormone, CRP, it's called the CRP for the short, abbreviated form, and that's also a high predictor for the stress. We found that, it's, certainly in the high meditation group, it comes down, as you see on the left bar, that high meditation group. Also, they become more hopeful, that so their degree of hopefulness, actually high meditation, high practice group actually goes up after 8 weeks of meditation. Now, how far we can take? Can we take this to the elementary school children? And in Atlanta, we have two, among other schools, we chose 2 schools, one private, it's called Paideia School, and another one is a public school, Morningside Public School. In 2 schools we have introduced here, and then as you can see that our, the 2 instructors sitting there, very good colleagues, and really Brandon and Brooke, they have been teaching in this population. Of course, they were nervous at first, as Brooke says that. At first, I was a bit worried about whether or not we could teach these concepts to very young children, but their creativity and ability to grasp these teachings completely blew my mind. That did it really do that? The data is not yet fully analyzed, but what we are seeing is that really quite kind of the same thing with the CRP, the stress hormone. There is a difference, but we need to do more analysis. Some of the insights from the schools, that the young children, these are complex ideas. That do they really get it? When you talk about the many emotional kind of the episodes that going on, can you become aware that when you describe to them like the little sparks and the forest fire, if you don't, put them off, that it will become forest fires and so forth in order to kind of convey. You need to have a different way to convey to them. Or in terms of the interconnectedness, like your sweater or the food, the sandwich you eat, how many people are involved, from the people who made the sandwich to the farmers who transported the things, the supermarkets, and so forth and so on. Or, so these are, you see that the children, like the 5 years of it says that I have a lot of forest fires in my life, that the awareness about this, that emotional thing. If you really think about it, you can relate to everybody somehow. It's about the empathy, this about impartiality and the empathy part. Where does it stop? It never stops. That's the interconnectedness, that when through discussions and the place when you, convey these ideas, the idea of our interconnectedness, they get it. It never stops. Even in images, that creative images like that, to this attention part, which is not distracted, nor thinking or the sleepy or with the laxity, but just the right. The children, these are drawn by this is by an 8-year-old kid. So, that what it tells is that I think that what we need is to find a way to learn from these traditions, like the tradition, this Nalanda tradition that His Holiness mentions about, not as a religious tradition, but in that those information for cultivating these inner skills, whether it's attention or the empathy or the impartiality, compassion, a sense of interconnectedness, and this, because it is a very, very rich, reservoir of knowledge when it comes to understanding inner mind and emotions and so forth. And from this tradition, as we engage, as the scientists engage with this tradition, I think there is a lot that can be learned. At the same point, I just want to take this opportunity to just also to echo what His Holiness has been saying, and the Geshe Jimbala mentioned yesterday also, that to my fellows here, the Buddhists, that particularly the monastics who are now going to be embracing modern science in their curriculum, what we need to really kind of keep in mind is that the knowledge that our tradition represents, embodies, is so profound, so needed for today's world to make the education holistic. That what His Holiness has been teaching tirelessly, and through this kind of dialogues and so forth. So as you study modern science, it's not that if I were you, I would think that it would not be just to know what the science says or what the science does, but rather I would learn modern science with the goal that the rich knowledge that Buddhist tradition embodies, how can this knowledge be highlighted, can be brought into more kind of, through scientific collaborations with others to, better understanding, to advance the understanding of these practices, the methods, this, so that you can, in the future, through this collaboration, what the Venerable Matthew has been doing, likewise, that you can, through not only with knowledge, but actually with the practice as well also, that you can advance this knowledge, that will only benefit humanity. I think that's what I would like to request to the Buddhist my Buddhist fellows at the end in that way, that if we can do that, then we will be able to make a small contribution towards fulfilling the goals, the aspirations of His Holiness Dalai Lama, to make a little the contribution to his effort in what His Holiness has in mind as he advocates for this secular ethics. In the end of the book, Beyond Religion, for the secular ethics, he says that my hope and wish is that one day formal education will pay attention to what I call education of the heart. Just as we take for granted the need to acquire proficiency in basic academic subjects, I am hopeful that a time will come when we take it for granted that the children will learn as part of their school curriculum the indispensability of inner values such as love, compassion, justice, and forgiveness. Thank you.